first time ever for many people who are stuck with one plan or can't get into any plan. Let me ask you this question as we get back to this point. Do you still believe that we should abolish that provision in Obamacare that says you can't discriminate against people with pre-existing conditions who apply for health insurance?
I will answer that question, and since I have not yielded the floor, I'd like to make a broader point after that and halt this colloquy, and I'll point out why, which is that we're operating under some time constraints, so I want to do what you asked of detailing the unanimous consent requests I want to promulgate so that you and the majority leader may consider them, and I also want to be respectful of both Senator Grassley and Senator Sessions, who have been waiting to speak, and you and I have engaged in multiple exchanges both now and earlier, and so I want to be respectful of the other senators on the floor. But let me answer your question. I believe we should repeal every word of Obamacare. I think it has failed. I agreed with James Hoffa that on behalf of millions of working men and women and the families they support, that the Affordable Care Act will destroy the very health and well-being of our members along with millions of other hardworking Americans. And so I think we should repeal it. I think we should defund it in the interim. This is not a fight over repealing. It's a fight over defunding it. And then I think we should adopt free market plans to lower prices, make health care more affordable, make it portable, and allow it to go with individuals.
And now will the Senator answer my question whether his family is protected by the government-administered federal employees health benefit program, the best health insurance in America, where his employer, the federal government, pays 72% of his monthly premium. Will the senator from Texas, for the record, tell us now and those who watch this debate whether he is protected?
I am happy to tell you I'm eligible for it and I'm not currently covered under it. And let me note that the senator from Illinois embraced the analogy and said, yes, we in Congress have first-class health care.
We do.
And under your analogy, you want to stick Judy in coach class. And what Senator Grassley's amendment was all about is, you know what, if you stick Judy in coach class, guess what? Members of Congress are going back in coach class. Now, you and I may disagree. I don't think Judy's in coach class. I think she's down in the baggage claim. But regardless,
she's not on the plane.
On your hypothetical, you're conceding that the congressional health care plan right now is better than Judy's under Obamacare, and you are saying that you support a special exemption for members of Congress that Judy doesn't get, and I agree with Senator Grassley's amendment that we shouldn't be forcing millions of Americans into coverage that we're not willing to experience. Now, I recognize the passion of the senator, but I would note that I have not yielded the floor. And I would like to describe the unanimous request, briefly describe the unanimous request that I would like to promulgate, and I would ask the Assistant Majority Leader and the Majority Leader to confer with my staff and simply let me know if these requests would be amenable or not. I'm not promulgating them at this time because I don't want to surprise leadership staff without giving you a time to consider them. The first unanimous request that I would propose to promulgate is a request that we vitiate the cloture on the motion to proceed that is scheduled this afternoon and agree by unanimous consent to proceed to this bill. To my knowledge, I'm not aware of any senator in this body that opposes proceeding to this bill. I think all of us agree we should proceed to this bill. We should keep the government open. Some of us think we should keep the government open and defund Obamacare. Others think we should fund it. But to the best of my knowledge, no one disagrees. So if the majority is amenable, I would propose vitiating the cloture request and simply agreeing to the motion to proceed. That would be the first unanimous consent request I would promulgate if it is agreeable to the majority. The second unanimous request that I would promulgate is the second one I would promulgate, if it's agreeable to the majority, is, as I understand on the timing, if all of the delays are put in place, cloture on the bill would be scheduled to occur on Saturday. Now, in my view, in order to defeat cloture on the bill, you know I want to defeat cloture on the bill. That is no secret. I think the best chance to defeat cloture on the bill is for this vote to be visible for the American people, highly visible. And so accordingly, I would be amenable to shortening the time for post-cloture debate such that that vote on cloture on the bill occurs on Friday afternoon rather than Saturday. Now, why is that? Because I think Friday afternoon, a lot more American people are going to pay attention to what we're doing than a vote on Saturday during football games when people are paying attention to other things. Now, that may or may not be amenable to the majority. But if it is, we can shorten this time by a period, because I think we have a better chance in prevailing in this fight if that vote, and I note the majority leader is here, so I don't know if he heard the initial unanimous consent, which, if it is amenable to the majority leader, we would negotiate the language with him and promulgate. So the first one that I offered, Mr. Leader, and I have not yielded the floor, but I'm describing during my time on the floor UCs that I would promulgate if the majority would be amenable. The first would be to vitiate the cloture request and simply agree on the motion to proceed, because to my knowledge, everyone in this body agrees we should proceed to this bill, although we have sharp disagreements on what we should do. The second UC, if it's amenable to the majority, that I would suggest, and I think the majority leader heard this as he was walking in, is to agree to shorten the time of post-cloture debate such that cloture on the bill would occur Friday afternoon rather than Saturday. And the reason is, and I'm being very transparent about my reasoning, I think it is better for this country if this vote is at a time that is visible for the whole country so that the American people have a voice in it, and I think sticking it on Saturday in the middle of football games disserves that objective. And then the third request, that if the majority leader would be amenable, I would put forward. As I understand it, under the rules of the Senate, in some 35 minutes, my time will be automatically cut off as a new legislative day begins, and it begins with a prayer. When I started this filibuster yesterday afternoon, I told the American people that I intended to stand until I could stand no more. And I will observe to the majority leader, although I am weary, there is still at least strength in my legs to stand a little longer. So the third thing I would simply ask is if the majority would consent to allow me to speak until the conclusion of my remarks, and then begin the next legislative day and have the prayer at the conclusion of those remarks. If the majority says no, then my time will end at noon under the rules of the Senate. So it is entirely up to the majority whether to let me continue to speak or not. But given that I began by saying I'll speak till I can stand no more, I believe I should at least ask if those consents are amenable. Now, I would note that under the rules of the Senate, if the majority leader cares to ask a question, I can yield for a question in which he might share his views, or if the majority leader wants to think about it, to discuss it with his staff, then I would note that the majority leader could simply convey to my staff if any or none of those UCs are amenable, and if none of them are, that is fine, and we'll conclude at noon.
Majority Leader.
Is there a consent that sorry, I just heard a lot of...
No consent has been provided.
Okay.
Madam President, there's been no consent.
Senator from Texas.
I just want to clarify, I have the floor. I haven't yielded the floor to anyone. Neither the majority leader nor any other member has the right of recognition right now. If the majority leader wishes, he may ask me to yield for a question, and I might yield for that limited purpose. But other than that, no one has the floor, if I understand the rules of this body correctly. So
the senator is correct.
So I make that note. If the majority leader would care to ask a question, I would be amenable to yielding for a question. But if the majority leader would not, that is certainly his prerogative, and I'm happy to continue talking about the issues that this debate has focused the country on, because they are issues of incredible importance to the working men and women of America.
I'm without a question.
Very well. Then, Madam President, and I would simply note to the majority leader, if those unanimous requests are amenable, I would ask that his staff convey that to my staff, and if they're not, I would ask that his staff convey that to my staff, simply so we know which way to proceed. Regardless, I want to make sure before we wrap up, because I assume now in 31 minutes we will be concluded, I want to yield to Senator Grassley in just a moment, because I don't want to miss, I apologize, Senator Grassley, but I don't want to miss the opportunity within the limited time to do something that is imperative that I do. which is to thank the men and women who have endured this baton death march. And I want to take a little bit of time to thank by name. I want to start by thanking the Republican floor staff and cloakroom. I want to thank Laura Dove for her fairness, for her dealing with crises and passions on all sides, and for her effectiveness in the job. And this is an interesting occurrence to occur so early in her job, and I thank her for her service. I want to thank Robert Duncan, Patrick Kilker, Chris Tuck, Megan Mercer, Mary Elizabeth Taylor, and Amanda Faulkner. I want to thank Democratic floor staff and cloakroom. I want to thank Gary Myrick, Tim Mitchell, Trish Engel, Meredith Melody, Dan Tinsley, Tekoya Delgado, Brad Witt, and Stephanie Paone. I want to thank the clerks and parliamentarians. I want to thank the Capitol Police. I want to thank the Sergeant-at-Arms and the Secretary of the Senate employees. And the parliamentarians, Elizabeth McDonough, Lee Hildebrand, and Michael Beaver, the legislative clerk, Kathy Alvarez, the journal, Scott Sanborn, the bill clerk, Marianne Clarkson, the Daily Digest, Elizabeth Trados, the enrolling clerk, Casey Bird, the chief reporter, Jerry Linnell, Congressional Record, Sylvia Oliver, Pam Garland, Desi Jura, Joel Breitner, Doreen Chendorain, Julie Bryan, Patrick Renzi, Mark Stewart, Wendy Caswell, Ann Riley, Patrick Boyd, Mary Carpenter, Octavio Colominas, captioning, Joe Ellen Dickin, Jim Hall, Sandra Shum, the Sergeant-at-Arms, the Secretary of the Senate employees, the Senate pages, many of whom I may have caused you guys to miss school, and I appreciate you all enduring this, and all of those who work in the Capitol complex. I want to thank my entire staff, many of whom have been here all night, have been here, and after this is proceeded, I intend to enter their names in the record, but I will not read them at this point in the chamber. I want to thank the Democratic senators who have presided, Senator Baldwin, Senator Manchin, Senator Warren, Senator Donnelly, Senator Kaine, Senator Murphy, Senator Schatz, Senator Baldwin again, Senator Donnelly, Senator Durbin, Senator Heitkamp, and Senator Markey. And I want to thank the Republican senators who have spoken in support of our efforts. Senator Sessions, Senator Rubio, Senator Paul, Senator Inhofe, Senator Enzi, Senator Roberts, Senator Vitter, very soon, Senator Grassley. I want to thank the House members who have come over, Senator Amash, Representative Amash, Representative Brown, Representative Hudson. I want to make special note of Representative Gohmert, who was here the entire night enduring this. I want to make a point, particularly to the floor staff and to everyone. Y'all didn't choose this. I appreciate the hard work and diligence going through the night. That's not part of your typical job responsibility. I would not have imposed on your time and energy if I did not believe this was an issue of vital importance to the American people. But I want to thank you for your hard work and diligence and cheerfulness through what has been a very long night. And I want to thank, second to last, Senator Mike Lee. Senator Mike Lee began this fight. Senator Mike Lee has been here throughout the course of this battle. Senator Mike Lee has been always cheerful, always focused, always ready to march into battle, and always focused on the ultimate objective, which is serving the American people by standing and fighting to stop the train wreck, the nightmare, the disaster that is Obamacare. We wouldn't be here if it wasn't for Senator Lee's principle, for his courage, for his bravery under fire, and I feel particularly honored to serve as his colleague and to consider him a friend. And last, I want to thank the American people. I want to thank the people all across this country that watched on C-SPAN, that tweeted, that engaged, that have been involved in this process, because this is ultimately about the American people. And what this whole fight is about is whether this body, the Democratic senators and the Republican senators, will change the broken ways of Washington and start listening to the people. That's what this fight is all about. And with those thank yous, which I apologize, but I felt obliged to conclude before 12 o'clock when my time will be cut off by force, I would note at this point Senator Grassley had wanted to ask a question. And if he asks, I'm prepared to yield for a question if Senator Grassley wishes to ask me to yield for a question.
Madam President,
The Majority Leader.
I ask my friend from Texas to yield to me without losing his right to the floor for a colloquy.
Would the senator so yield?
With the reservation that I do not lose the right to the floor, I'm happy to engage in a colloquy with the Majority Leader.
Madam President, first of all, this is not a filibuster. This is an agreement that he and I made that he could talk. Now, let me say this. We're going to have a vote about 1 o'clock today. And after that's over, we'll follow the rules of the Senate. But my goal is to get this to the House of Representatives as quickly as possible. I think a lot of this time has been, without talking about what's transpired to this point, I would hope that we could collapse the time dramatically and move forward so that the House of Representatives can get what we're going to send back to them. You know, there's a possibility that they may not accept what we send them, and they may want to send us something back. If we use all this time under the rules as they now exist,
President, since I did not yield my right to the floor, I was amenable to a colloquy, but the Majority Leader is giving a speech, and given that, as I understand it, the Majority Leader is not going to consent to extend the time, I have 24 minutes, and so I'm going to reassert my time on the floor since I have not yielded my time on the floor.
If I could ask a consent agreement with my friend.
Is there objection?
There is objection. I'm sorry, I cannot be asked to consent to an unnamed consent agreement. And given that the Majority Leader, as I understand it, is not going to consent to extend my time, then let me say quite simply to the Majority Leader that I will yield time to you for a question when the Majority Leader is prepared to yield to the American people. But I'm not going to yield prior to that because Senator Grassley and Senator Sessions and Senator Inhofe are waiting to speak, and I believe they are endeavoring to listen to the American people. And if the Majority Leader is going to cut off and muzzle us in another 24 minutes, then at this point I don't feel it is appropriate to allow the Majority Leader to consume that time. And so I will note to any of the senators who are here, if anyone would care to, I know a number of you are waiting to ask questions, that I'm prepared to yield for a question to any of you.
I have a question I'd like to ask my friend from Texas.
Senator from Texas, yield for a question.
The floor.
Without losing.
I will yield for a question without yielding the floor.
From between 12 and 1 o'clock, would my friend yield to Senator McCain for 15 minutes of that time?
That question is asked, but it will not prove necessary, absent the consent that I promulgated, and I'm assuming that would not be acceptable to the majority, because my time will end at noon. So there's nothing left to yield, because as I understand it on the Senate rules, when the new legislative day begins and the prayer begins, my time yields. So with that...
No, Madam President, he has the right to talk from 12 to 1 o'clock. I'm asking, consent is, would he allow during that period of time Senator McCain to speak for 15 minutes?
Under my understanding, my time expires at noon, and absent a consent to extend it, I will honor the Senate rules and allow my time to expire at noon, so there's nothing to yield. And I will note Senator Sessions is standing if he cares to.
Madam President, will the Senator yield for a question?
I will yield with a question without yielding the floor.
Senator,
the Majority Leader.
Madam President, parliamentary inquiry, Madam President.
Does the senator from Texas yield for a parliamentary inquiry?
Given that the Majority Leader has cut off our time in 20 minutes, no, I'm sorry, I do not. The Majority Leader was welcome to come down any time in the past 20 hours and ask parliamentary inquiries or questions any time. I would note that Senator Durbin did so, Senator Kaine did so, other senators did so, and at this point our time is expiring, and I want to allow other Republican senators who have appeared and asked to ask questions to have the opportunity to do so.
Madam President.
The Majority Leader.
Can I direct a question to my friend from Texas?
Does the senator yield for a question?
I will yield for one more question without yielding the floor.
Here's a question. You seem to not understand that you have, after the prayer is given at 12 o'clock, you have time until 1 o'clock. And during that period of time, my question was, because you still have the floor, would you yield 15 minutes of that to John McCain?
It is my intention, if the consent request that I asked is not agreed to accept the end of this at noon under the Senate rules.
I understand. Thank you very much.
Madam President,
Does the senator from Texas yield
for a question?
for a question?
I'm happy to yield for a question without yielding the floor.
I thought that was a very gracious question that our offer of unanimous consent that we would vitiate the vote and 30 hours of debate, and you asked very little in exchange for it other than to continue, I guess, to talk
And actually, let me briefly clarify. I asked nothing in exchange for that. None of those were contingent on each other. Those were three independent unanimous consent requests, which are simply the majority leader wanted to consent to any of those. Those were not, it wasn't an offer of horse trade. It was simply, I think all three of those make sense. I think any one of the three of them makes sense. If he chooses to reject them all, that's his prerogative, and that's fine. I was just suggesting we not waste this body's time by doing so.
Well, to follow up on that, then it seems to me that what you were saying would be an offer that would most everyone here would be pleased to receive and accept, unless they have some surreptitious motive. In addition, I think your request to be allowed to continue to speak is reasonable. I think you've earned the right to ask that. You've now spoken, and the American people are watching. Fourth longest time, I believe, any filibuster or just floor time has been held by a senator. I think that's a perfectly reasonable request to allow you to continue to express the concerns that you've expressed. So I'm somewhat taken aback that it wasn't agreed to, and but to just again to make clear, it would seem to me little, if any, reason that they would object to that. Majority would object to that.
Well, I thank my friend from Alabama, and I would note that unfortunately, I'm not surprised that none of those consent were taken. I note the first two consents one would think would be quite amenable, and yet, look, throughout this debate, the problem has been the majority does not want to listen to the American people and doesn't want to debate in front of the American people, particularly about the merits of Obamacare. They don't want to talk about how Obamacare is failing millions of Americans. They don't want to talk about how millions of Americans are losing their jobs or not being hired. They don't want to talk about how millions of Americans are facing being pushed into part-time work. They don't want to talk about how millions of Americans are either losing their health insurance or at risk of losing their health insurance. And so this process is all about, sadly, the Democratic majority not listening to the American people. And the whole purpose of this filibuster was to do everything we could to draw this issue to the attention of the American people so the American people could be heard, and if the American people speak with sufficient volume, I continue to have confidence that this body, that the senators on both sides of the aisle will have no choice but listen. Now, given that we have 16 minutes remaining, I inadvertently omitted in my thank yous the doorkeepers, and I don't want to do so. That was by accident. The doorkeepers: Tucker Eagleson, Don Gazunas, Elizabeth Garcia, Rocketta Gillis, Mark O'Connor, Laverne Allen, Daniel Benedict, Cindy Kessler, Scott Machette, Tony Goldsmith, Jim Jordan, Megan Sheffield, David West, Dennis Houlihan, Bob Shelton. And let me say, for any of the floor staff or others, if I inadvertently omitted someone, please accept my apologies. It is my intention to endeavor to thank anyone, and if I have made an inadvertent admission, that is my fault, and I take responsibility for it. I want to note also that an additional member of Congress, Congressman Steve King, has joined us. I want to thank Congressman King for joining us. And I would note, as we are in the last 15 minutes, that if my friend and colleague, Senator Mike Lee, would wish to ask a question, I would certainly be prepared to yield as we are wrapping up.
Will the gentleman from Texas yield for a question?
I will yield for a question without yielding the floor.
You know, from day one, there have been those in the Washington establishment who have been working against this effort. And it was the American people who stood up in strong support of it. It was the American people who served as the heroes in this story, who spoke overwhelmingly to the Congress, spoke overwhelmingly to the House of Representatives, convinced the House of Representatives to pass this great continuing resolution, one that keeps government funded, allows us to avoid a shutdown while defunding Obamacare.
I don't really care.
That's what this effort has been all about. It's been about the people we're trying to protect from this harmful law. And across the country, Americans stayed up with us overnight, forging this argument, helping us distribute this argument, choosing to forego sleep, and to show that they're supportive of this effort. And we greatly appreciate that. I want to take a moment to reflect on how all of us who have been up all night feel right now, you know, with dry eyes, with a certain amount of grogginess. And yet, ultimately, this is an exhilarating moment. It's exhilarating because we're inspired by the American people who have informed this message and who have expressed their views so well and so forcefully with the American people. I'm grateful to have been part of this effort. So I ask you, Senator Cruz, as we come to the end of this uphill climb that we've experienced over the last 24 hours, give or take, as we see that the cards are somewhat stacked against us, and today, although Washington may appear to have the upper hand, don't we know that in our hearts, don't we know that the American people are with us? And don't we know that the American people will have the final word? And that, as George Washington predicted a couple of centuries ago, this country would always remain in good hands, in the hands of its people.
I thank my friend, Senator Lee from Utah, and I think that's exactly right. At the end of the day, the United States of America, it is we the people that are sovereign. And ultimately, every member of this body works for we the people. The reason there is such profound frustration across this country, the reason this body is held in such abysmally low esteem, is that for too long, Washington has not listened to the American people. Every survey of the American people, doesn't matter what state, doesn't matter whether you're talking Republicans, Democrats, Independents, or Libertarians, the answer is always the same. The top priority for the American people is jobs and the economy. And, Madam President, you and I both began serving 9 months ago as freshmen in this body. I will tell you my greatest frustration in this body is during those 9 months. We have spent virtually zero time even talking about jobs and the economy. We spent 6 weeks talking about guns and taking away people's Second Amendment rights. But when it comes to jobs and the economy, in this United States Senate, it doesn't even make the agenda. We spend no time talking about fundamental tax reform. We spend no time, or virtually no time, talking about regulatory reform. And when it comes to defunding Obamacare, the single biggest thing we can do to restore jobs in the economy, the Democratic majority is not interested in that conversation. Indeed, for the bulk of this conversation, with a couple of exceptions, the Democratic majority chose not to engage in the debate. Why? I would submit because on the merits, on the substance, the defense of Obamacare is now indefensible. There may have been some, even many, who 3.5 years ago when Obamacare was adopted believed in good faith it was going to work. But at this point, the facts are evident that it is not. At this point, we have seen small businesses all over this country who are losing the ability to compete, who are not expanding, who are staying under 50 employees, who are not hiring and who are forcing employees to move to part-time work. According to the Chamber of Commerce survey of small businesses, half of small businesses eligible for the employee mandate are either moving to part-time workers or forcing full-time workers to go part-time. This is not a small problem. This is not a marginal problem. This is a problem all over the country. You're talking millions of small businesses. And another, I believe it's 24%, are simply not growing to stay under 50 employees, which means they're not hiring people. So anyone in America right now who's struggling to find a job, small businesses provide 2/3 of all new jobs. Small businesses are crying out that Obamacare is killing them. And unfortunately, the United States Senate is not hearing their cries. For the millions of Americans that are facing the threat of being forced into part-time work. Unfortunately, the United States Senate is not hearing their cry. For the millions of Americans who are facing skyrocketing health insurance premiums and facing the reality or the risk of losing their health insurance, the United States Senate is not hearing their cry. And the people who are facing this are not the wealthy, they're not the powerful, they're not, as the President likes to say, the millionaires and billionaires. They're the most vulnerable among us. They're young people who are being absolutely decimated by Obamacare. They are single moms who are working in diners, struggling but suddenly finding their hours reduced to 29 hours a week. But the problem is 29 hours a week is not enough to feed your kids. Single moms are crying out to the United States Senate, fix this train wreck, fix this disaster. And for the struggling single moms, for young people, unfortunately, the U.S. Senate is closed for business.
Mr. President. Mr. President.
The senator from Idaho.
Thank you, Mr. President. Would the good senator yield for a question without yielding the floor, please?
I am happy to yield for a question without yielding the floor, although I will note we have all of 6.5 minutes till the time will expire.
And I'll be brief, and I want to talk very briefly and ask a question about the area that you were just talking about. My good friend Senator Rubio made reference to this story that I'm going to tell, and I wish we had. My good friends from the other side of the aisle are very good about bringing out pictures of people with sad faces, and my only regret is I don't have a picture of somebody with a sad face, but I can assure you these people are greatly saddened by this. We had a hearing in the Small Business Committee, and we brought people from around the country, small businesses who were suffering under this terrible burden, and you weren't here in the middle of the night when this abomination was shoved down the throat of the American people on a straight party line vote in the middle of the night. I can assure you we fought it tooth and nail, but now the American people are having to live with this, and it's good to be reminding them again what we have here. But this gentleman operated a business called Dot's Diners in Louisiana, and he had, I forgot, 6 or 7 diners. And this man was living the all-American dream. He had quit a very good job, cashed in his retirement, borrowed money, and he and his wife opened a diner. And the diner did well because they worked hard, and like you did all night tonight, sometimes they worked that hard. They opened more diners, and we're just about to open another one when the United States Senate announced that they were going to force Obamacare on the American people and on the small businesses of this country. They stopped immediately the plans to open a new one. And they then looked at what Obamacare was going to cost them. And the cost of Obamacare was substantially higher than the profits they were making in the business every year. So what they did is they went and got counsel and said, how can we get around Obamacare? And what they were told is, if you have 49 employees, you're outside of Obamacare. So given that, what they did is they closed the diner and got down to 49 employees, and that's where they are. Can you tell me, Senator, I'd like to hear your thoughts on that and whether you believe that this is the way the American government, the government that our founding fathers fought for and died for, is this what they should be visiting on the American people, particularly on small businessmen who are the backbone of this economy?
I thank the senator from Idaho for his question. and for his steadfast leadership and willingness to stand up and fight for the American people to stop this train wreck that is Obamacare. And the answer to my friend's question is, of course, no. Small businesses all over this country are getting hammered by Obamacare. And, you know, the real losers are not even the small business owners. The real losers are the people, the teenage kids who would get hired, the single moms who would get hired, the African Americans, the Hispanics, who are suddenly finding themselves either without a job or forcibly reduced to 29 hours a week and denied the opportunity to get to that first rung of the economic ladder, which would give them the second and the third and the fourth. Millions of Americans are hurting under Obamacare. And it is my plea to this body, to the Democrats, that they listen to the unions that are asking on behalf of millions of Americans who are struggling to repeal Obamacare, and that we not have a system where the rich and powerful, where big corporations and members of Congress are treated to a different set of rules than hardworking Americans. President Obama has granted exemptions illegally to big businesses and members of Congress. I don't think the American people should be subject to harsher rules. And so my plea to this body is that we listen to the American people, because if we listen to our constituents, the answer is defund this bill that isn't working, that's hurting the American people, that's killing jobs, that's forcing people into part-time work, that's driving up health insurance premiums, and that's causing millions to lose or fear that they will lose their health insurance. I will close, as the time is wrapping up, by noting when at noon we will have a prayer. And I think it's fitting that this debate conclude with a prayer, because I would ask that everyone in this body ask for the Lord's guidance on how we best listen to our constituents, listen to the pleas for help that are coming from our constituents. The final thing I'll do is ask the first two consents that I mentioned, and the Majority Leader may or may not agree to them. The first unanimous consent request, I ask unanimous consent that the cloture vote at 1 p.m. be vitiated, and that at the conclusion of my remarks, the motion to proceed to the resolution be agreed to.
Mr. President.
Is there objection? The Majority Leader.
Reserving the right to object. Mr. President, my friend has had an opportunity to speak. I'll speak at a longer period of time in a few minutes about his statement that he's made the last several hours. But he's spoken. At 1 o'clock, the Senate will speak, and we will follow the rules of the Senate. I've said very clearly on a number of occasions we should be moving quickly to get this to the House as soon as we can. I object.
Objection is heard.
Mr. President, I will ask a second unanimous consent request. I ask unanimous consent that if a cloture motion is filed on the underlying measure, that cloture vote occur during Friday's session of the Senate, notwithstanding the provisions of Rule 22.
Is there objection?
Mr. President.
Majority Leader.
Reserving the right to object. We're going to have a cloture vote at 1 o'clock, and any consent agreements after that, I'd be happy to listen to them. At this stage, I object.
Objection is heard.
Well, then it appears I have the floor for another 90 seconds or so. And so I simply want to note to the American people who have so engaged that this debate's in your hands. Ultimately, all 100 senators, all 46 Republicans, all 54 Democrats work for you. The pleas from the American people, I tell you, in Texas, are deafening. The frustration that the United States Senate doesn't listen to the people is deafening. So I would call on all 46 Republicans to stand together and to vote against cloture on the bill on Friday or Saturday, because otherwise, if we vote with the Majority Leader and with the Senate Democrats, we will be voting to allow the Majority Leader to fund Obamacare on a straight party line vote, a 51-vote partisan vote. And the American people will understand that. And voting to give that power to the Majority Leader, I would suggest, is not consistent with, I believe, the heartfelt commitment of all 46 members of this conference to oppose Obamacare. The only path, if we're going to oppose Obamacare, is to stand together and oppose cloture. And I would ask for my friends on the Democratic aisle to listen to the...
The hour the hour of noon having arrived pursuant to the order of the Senate will be in order. The Senators